Hi, I'm Lachlan Irvine. Today is the 18th of February 2024, and I'm going to read an extract from my website, lachlanirvine.tripod.com, about my memories of this day in 1968. At that time, I was the SIG, or radio operator, of Anti-Tank Platoon 3 RAR. That's the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. It's a couple of weeks into the Tet Offensive, and we've already fought in Baria and Long Dien, and now we've moved to Bien Hoa Province on Operation Coburg. Our base for Operation Coburg was Fire Support Base Andersen, situated near the town of Trang Bom on Route 1 northeast of Saigon. At Andersen, I was hoochied up with Gary Polglaze, known to all as Polly, a dog handler in the tracker team. In other words, we shared a weapon pit and slept in adjacent sleeping pits. You may well ask, what is the importance of Polly's role in my recollections of Andersen? The answer is that the reason you're reading this story is quite possibly because you've come across my poem He Was a Mate, which I wrote as a way of dealing with my own feelings about Polly's death, which happened just short of a month after the events of this story, and it was at Andersen that we became close friends. As I tell the story of the Battle of Andersen, I will make use of quotes from the battalion's history of its tour of duty. This is one occasion when the battalion book goes into great detail and is therefore a great help to my own memory. I should also point out that unlike Long Tan, Coral, Balmoral, little has been written about Andersen. In fact, a recently published book by historian Paul Ham, entitled Vietnam, the Australian War, makes no mention of it whatsoever, not a single word. So what I write here now will provide a rare opportunities for Australians actually to find out about this battle. We arrived at Andersen on the 17th of February. We replaced another Australian battalion. I don't exactly remember which one, but both 2 RAR and 7 RAR had been involved in Operation Coburg since late January. Anti-Tank Platoon took up a position on the perimeter, facing southwest, with Mortar Platoon, and beyond them the Americans on our right, and the Assault Pioneer Platoon on our left. In front of us was a wide expanse of rice paddy, with a tree line beyond it, about 400 metres away. To the right of the tree line was a couple of 100 metres of open space, and to the right of that was Trang Bom. We moved into the weapon pits and sleeping pits that were already there, having been vacated by 2 RAR or 7 RAR. They had no overhead cover. The battalion history describes the beginning of the battle that first night. Here's a quote. Sentries saw the first indication of an impending enemy attack shortly before midnight, when a green signal rocket was fired above the base by enemy in the vicinity of Route 1. An hour later, enemy mortarmen hit the base with a heavy barrage of 60 and 82mm mortars, accompanied by RPG-7 rocket fire. Private Doherty, Mortar Platoon, and Private De Vries van Leeuwen, A Company, were killed in this initial bombardment. Polly and I were woken by the first mortar barrage, but, having never experienced a mortar attack before, we didn't know what was happening until our platoon sergeant came around telling everyone in the platoon to stand to and prepare for a ground assault. One comment I would make about the account of this and other actions in the battalion history is that the book mentions only 3 RAR casualties. There were 7 men killed on our side at Andersen that night, including Americans as well as Australians from an engineers unit. Here's another quote from the book. The Viet Cong mortar crews switched their fire from east to west along the position, but were engaged within 6 minutes of the initial firing by the 3 RAR mortars, once their positions had been pinpointed. Within 15 minutes, a green flare signalled the continuation of this attack, with a ground assault against the perimeter of the American medium battery and the battalion echelon and mortar position. The Viet Cong pushed onto the wire in 2 successive waves from a high paddy bun to the southwest, the first wave throwing grenades and immediately followed up by a heavier thrust accompanied by RPG-2 and RPG-7 rocket fire. I have tried to find words that could describe what it feels like to have rockets fired at you and to see them go right over your head or fly right past, but I'm afraid this is one time when I just have to say, you had to be there. One of these rockets flew past anti-tank and hit an American fuel truck just behind and to our right. The explosion sent fireballs everywhere. Later I found that a hole had been burnt in the right sleeve of my shirt, even though I knew I hadn't been directly hit. What annoyed me most is that this was a shirt that had been given to me by an American. Wherever we went in Vietnam, Americans were amazed at, by their standards, how Spartan the Australian Army was. They couldn't believe we slept on the ground and not on airbeds. They couldn't believe we maintained complete silence and darkness at night. No generators, no lights, no speaking above a whisper. They couldn't believe we had to fill in a loss and damage report to get a new shirt. When they found out how we lived, they were extraordinarily generous. When we arrived at Andersen, we found ourselves working in close proximity to an American communications truck. And we hadn't known these guys for more than a couple of hours when they were giving us their clothes and equipment. So that burnt hole was in the sleeve of an American shirt that I was wearing for the first time. Back to the battalion history. With support from enemy machine gunners, the impetus of the attack carried the Viet Cong assault waves through the wire, only to be halted by machine gun fire, both from the APCs and the American gunners. Close mortar defensive fire was also directed into the forming up place beyond the Paddy Bund. I must point out here, by the way, that the VC got through the wire in the American sector to our right. They didn't penetrate the 3 RAR perimeter. Shortly afterwards, a second probing attack was preceded by small arms and heavy machine gun fire from the north and southwest. Riflemen and machine gunners manning forward weapon pits threw back the subsequent ground assault before it reached the outer wire. That's us. There was a brief respite, however, before a second mortar barrage fell among the American and New Zealand gun positions, the mortar lines and the battalion echelon. It was during this attack that an engineer standing patrol received a direct hit from enemy mortars. During this attack, the mortar commander, Captain Blue Doyle, was wounded in the chest. He needed to get to the battalion command post to help coordinate a return of fire to knock out the VC mortars, so he simply pulled the shrapnel out of his own chest as he walked to the CP. The fate of the engineer standing patrol was a terrible tragedy. These patrols, also known as listening patrols, consisted of between about 4 to 10 men who would go out to a designated position outside the wire. When they got there, they would sit there all night, maintain radio silence, and watch and listen. The SIG would report in every hour by pressing the Pressel switch on his radio just to confirm that all was well. Throughout my tour of duty, I was the SIG on a lot of these patrols. In fact, I went out on one the night after the engineer patrol was wiped out. In a known enemy area such as Andersen, it is an extremely vulnerable position to be in. Of the 10-man engineer patrol, 4 were killed, 3 wounded, and 2 of the survivors would subsequently be killed on our next operation in the Long High Hills. Quoting the battalion history again, the enemy chose not to follow up this barrage with a ground assault, and the base remained quiet until dawn of the 18th of February. 4 Viet Cong bodies were found on the southern wire at dawn. Bloodstains and bandages found during a subsequent sweep across the perimeter showed that the enemy had suffered additional casualties both during his ground assault and at his mortar base plate position. And that was just the first attack. There were 2 more to come. Now we come to the morning after. I regard the 18th of February 1968 as one of the more significant days in my life. The events of that morning are still quite fresh in my memory 56 years later. After morning stand to, Polly and I settled down to brew up some coffee and breakfast and clean our weapons. The air was thick with the unmistakable sharp smell of cordite. It was quite a still morning, and various kinds of smoke mingled together with no wind to blow them away. Polly and I were exhausted but also exhilarated. There was a definite feeling of having come through some kind of rite of passage. Although we had been in action during Tet, Andersen was different. It felt like our real baptism of fire. It had certainly been a night of firsts, with our first experience of a mortar attack, our first experience of a rocket attack, our first experience of a ground assault in which we were the first line of defence. The overwhelming feeling during the firefight had been adrenaline-fuelled excitement rather than fear. It was while we were eating our breakfast and discussing the events of the night that we were informed for the first time about the night's casualties. The adrenaline drained out of us when we heard that 7 people had been killed on our side, not to mention an unknown number of VC. John Doherty was someone we knew, and he was killed in the mortar position right beside us. Around this time, someone came over with a book to swap. This was a common practice. There is a lot of downtime in a war zone, and most soldiers like to read. That's not to suggest we were a bunch of intellectuals, but given the variety of reading material available, most soldiers will find something to their taste. Since the number of accessible books is finite, they have to be kept circulating. Whenever a soldier was finished reading a book or found a book not to his liking, he went looking for someone to swap with. This particular morning, I took possession of a paperback with a red cover. Its title was unusual, Catch-22. I started reading it sometime during that day, and I have to confess that this is one book that did not continue to circulate once it came into my possession. I kept it with me, the way some people keep a Bible, reading from it every day for the remainder of my tour. Shortly after breakfast, Polly and I were visited by an American we had met the day before, and who would become a particular favourite of everyone in Anti-Tank Platoon during our stay at Andersen. His name was Slow Talker, and he was a Native American, a Navajo from Arizona. He suggested that we go for a walk over to the American sector and have a look at the VC bodies. Just inside the American sector, we found something that any Australian soldier would have found remarkable, a soft drink dispenser. This was like a large water cooler containing cordial instead of water. As soon as the sun went down each night, Australian soldiers would maintain complete silence and complete darkness until morning. The Americans, on the other hand, took generators out on operations with them. At Andersen, they had lights going and machinery operating all night, and yes, they could get cool drinks at any time. We stopped for a refreshing drink, and while I was pouring mine, I happened to look down. There on the ground next to my feet was a disembodied human thumb. I showed it to Polly and Slow Talker, and we looked at each other. But what is there to say when you find a thumb just sitting there on the ground? From the thumb and the cool drink dispenser, we moved across to the perimeter wire. There were 4 Viet Cong bodies. One was just inside the wire, one just outside, and 2 were actually on the wire. The one that made the greatest impression was the one without a head. Apparently he had copped a direct hit from a 40mm grenade fired from an M79 grenade launcher. Not only was his head blown off, but there was not a sign of any part of it to be seen. We walked back to the 3 RAR lines, where everybody was hard at work filling sandbags to add overhead cover to their sleeping pits. That's when my platoon commander told me I would be going out on a listening patrol that night. It would have been during a break from shoveling sand that I started reading Catch-22. Something about the madness of Joseph Heller's story of life in the US Air Force in World War II really appealed to me. In the book, there is a belly laugh on just about every page in the midst of death, destruction, and insanity. It somehow helped me to make sense of my own Vietnam experience. The 18th of February, 1968. I learnt a thing or two about war that day.